this Wednesday night in Hudson, New York. I'm here, my name's Noah Eckstein, I'm a journalist who lives in Hudson. I'm here with Madison Margolin, who is a journalist and author. She co-founded DoubleBlind magazine, which is a psychedelic magazine at the forefront of putting out psychedelic news and stories. And she also started the Jewish Psychedelic Summit, and she's been published in Playboy and Vice and Rolling Stone magazine and a bunch of different places. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So we'll start with Madison's going to read from her wonderful book.
All right, so yeah, I'm going to pick just a section from the introduction to get us started here and find that section. So just to give you some context, as the title suggests, or the subtitle, my book is about my experience, my childhood growing up in the community surrounding Ram Dass, who's the author of Be Here Now, former psychonaut from Harvard who ended up in India with a guru, and my experiences as a journalist ending up in the Hasidic underground of Brooklyn and the Catskills in very psychedelic spaces, which we'll talk about. So, okay, I'm just reading from the introduction now. But it wasn't so much that I wanted to simply interview rabbis, scientists, and underground ceremony leaders about Jews on drugs, bluntly put, but rather that I myself, as a Jew, wanted these experiences too. Those whom I initially met on the basis of my reportage during my 1 year of J school, or journalism school, and beyond, turned out to be my soul family. They felt instantly familiar and reminded me of the far-out characters who colored my childhood. I didn't want to just get third-person quotes about combining Jewish ritual with psychedelics. I wanted to see it with my own eyes, feel what it was like in my own body. Through these experiences, including an expanded outlook and a developed somaticism, I began to appreciate the roots of my own upbringing. It took growing up with hippies to find my way among Hasidim in order to ultimately come home to myself, in a full circle that enabled me to realize that it's all one, all the same thing, all part of one grand trip. Where I came from turned out to be close in soul to where I was going, although straddling California and New York, Israel and America remains a challenging distance. In fact, the concept of God that I grew up with was strikingly similar to what I learned about through Hasidic texts and teachings. It was through psychedelic consciousness that I came to this realization. And so, as one friend, the late Shlomi Freundlich, helped me phrase it for one of the many articles I wrote about this topic, I wanted to know, can you serve God through psychedelics? Those who knew Bundy, as he was called, might be surprised at such an apt articulation of this question, because his outer layer was more troll-like and crass than sensitive and contemplative. He was on the spectrum, would make off-color Holocaust jokes, and liked to introduce me to groups of Hasidic men by saying, "This is Madison, she's in Playboy." Then wait a beat before explaining that I wrote for the magazine about topics he considered controversial, like cannabis. He loved to retell the story of how we met. At 1:40 a.m., July 25th, 2015, a girl in a short black skirt walked into my Shabbos meal. "My name is Madison. I write for the Forward. I just came from a burner party. Give me challah." We forbrained, or kind of schmoozed, till 4 a.m. about Shabbos Chazon and sang Shabbos songs. End quote from Bundy. In his way, Shlomi's anecdote captures that zeitgeist for me. The summer I graduated journalism school, working at a Jewish newspaper, using my off hours to party my way through New York, maybe looking for some sort of transcendence, but ultimately finding it in Jewish spaces, flying and landing within the context of the religion itself. At which point I realized that Judaism has everything it takes to engender an altered experience, if only we knew how to activate its practices and engage with its perspectival frameworks in ways that were invigorating and soulful, rather than boring, traumatizing, or oppressive. So I'll stop there.
So I think when people saw that we were doing this event and they see the words psychedelics and Judaism together, they might think, oh, you're another Jew who likes to trip and that's that. A hippie be Jew. But in the book you talk about psychedelic Judaism, as both psychedelics are enmeshed in Judaism and maybe even vice versa. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, this whole this concept of Jewish psychedelia, or the whole Jewish psychedelic thing, has become a thing in the past, I'd say 5 years at least. And again, a lot of it was, I was writing about it, a few other people were writing about it, kind of crystallizing it into a movement when really it was just kind of happening. And so, yes, there's the old trope of LOL, we just took edibles at shul, okay, it goes much deeper than that. I mean, you could also still take edibles at shul and maybe have a better time there. But so it's psychedelic Judaism. I would put it into I'll explain it in multiple parts. So for one, I would say that the Jewish religion in and of itself is sort of a reflection of and a container for engendering altered states. And so one of my favorite books is called Magic of the Ordinary by Gershon Winkler, and it's about recovering the shamanic in Judaism, and it talks about how in the religion of the tribe, before we even had the Bible, was a very earth-based, indigenous style religion, in that you follow the cycles of the moon, and you do things with the 6 directions. On Sukkot, we shake a lulav, or a bundle of plants in all these directions, and it was very earth-based and looked something more like a religion of, a Native American Indian tribe than this academic, Christianized form of religion we're familiar with today. And so when I think about what is psychedelic, is something that really connects you back to your soul and also connects you back to nature. And so the genesis of the religion itself, I would say, in being so earth-based, kind of did that. Now, going forward, you have figures in Judaism, or actually, before we cut there, Judaism itself, when we did receive Torah or the Bible, that happened at Mount Sinai, which is described as one of the most psychedelic episodes in all of Jewish history, where the whole tribe was at Sinai having this synesthesiastic experience, seeing the sounds, hearing the colors, at which point that's where we got Torah from. So, and then the practice of Judaism, following Torah, so to speak, I think of it as sort of integrating that high state into our daily lives. How do we take that magic and make it, sustainable? Fast forward, and I know I'm talking a lot, I'm getting there. Fast forward, we do have figures like the Baal Shem Tov, who founded the Hasidic movement, who again was out in the fields of Ukraine and in the fields and the forests, kind of talking to God, working with plants. Again, having a kind of direct, unmediated divine connection, which in and of itself is sort of this psychedelic thing. He would go into these ascensions of the soul, it was called, and smoke from a pipe. And so everything with him was very ecstatic and meant to be serving God. And so that, when I think of, all of these examples, again, there's also rabbis like Rabbi Solomon Schechter Shalomi of the Jewish Renewal Movement, who had tripped along with Timothy Leary and Ram Dass and started a whole movement based, largely inspired by his psychedelic experiences, and now it's happening today. All of that goes to show that Judaism, again, both, can both reflect psychedelic consciousness and also have a container with which to engage with it. And so today what I've observed, both as a journalist and also as a human being, as a Jew, which is why I guess I call it concept journalism here, is that you can use Jewish frameworks like the religion itself or Shabbat or holiday as the set and setting to have an altered experience with or without a substance. And so, I write about in my book, some of the first times I did ayahuasca were on Shabbat, and it helped me kind of actually strengthen my own Shabbat practice, because I was sort of able to tune into that kind of sacred container of time, because my awareness was more refined thanks to the ayahuasca. So I think psychedelic Judaism is both honoring and looking back on the roots of what is actually psychedelic about Judaism in and of itself, and also finding ways to use the religion, the ritual and calendar and other practices as both the preparation, integration, and navigation for altered United States. Mouthful.
I think I'd like to give context to everyone here about your childhood and how you grew up. Yeah, if you can talk about your dad and your mom, and also you write in the book that you feel like your dad, who's now 82 years old, had from an early age a very internalized sense of anti-Semitism, and that pushed him away from going deeper into Judaism.
Yeah. So my dad grew up like in the wake of the Holocaust, and I remember he had told me that he questioned as a child, like, what's wrong with us that they're trying to kill us? And as I grew up, with my dad and a lot of his friends who are all Jewish from Long Island or New York or places like around here, essentially, they all had sort of pushed away their Judaism. It wasn't cool. It wasn't spiritual enough. It was just, the way it was presented to them was very dry and not really able to meet their needs, and I think part of the Jewish experience, like the word Yisrael literally means to wrestle with God, and so there is, I'd say, like an element of seeking that I see among a lot of Jewish people, and it doesn't mean you're wrestling with God by becoming a practicing Jew, but I think it does mean you're in some ways searching for sustenance, for answers, for connection in whatever ways present themselves. And so because my dad and his friends, and my mother to an extent as well, had all sort of been presented with this form of post-Holocaust Judaism that was a complete turnoff, they went instead to, they had done psychedelics, or part of the hippie generation, and my father ended up in India, where he met Ram Dass, and then Ram Dass introduced him to their guru, or his guru, and their guru, named Curly Baba or Maharaji. And a lot of the American followers of Maharaji, or devotees is what they're called, were mostly Jews. And again, people like my dad. And so growing up, I was surrounded by all these people whose integration of their psychedelic experiences came in the form of spiritual practice that had been presented to them in India. And they called themselves Hindus, kind of a joke, kind of not. It was this blend of, kind of traditional Judaism with, elements of Hinduism. So my dad, who's kind of hilarious, his name is Bruce, but, when he's with his satsang, or community of Maharaji devotees, goes by his Hindu name, which is Bhadranath. And if anyone's wearing a yarmulke and they ask his name, he says Baruch Meir, which is his Hebrew name. So, growing up, I had kind of traditional Judaism. My mom is from Queens, and my dad being a hippie, and he's also a criminal defense lawyer. So his specialty was defending cannabis crimes, and so he was sort of at the forefront of California's cannabis legalization movement. And I grew up surrounded by all of these sort of pot-smoking hippies coming to the house for kirtan or Hindu chanting events. My dad being really involved in drug policy reform. And yeah, that was, and again, we don't, have like rainbow gathering family, like at our Passover Seder's. So it was all these things in one.
How did that influence and shape your view of life, not just of Judaism, but of how to grow up? I mean, that sounds like such a radically free and open childhood. In part, it sounds like a dream, but also in ways not. Can you talk about both of those things?
Yeah, I mean, one primary question I had since I was a kid was, what are my parents looking for in Hinduism or psychedelics or whatever that they can't find in Judaism? And they had sent me to like this conservative Jewish preschool and through Hebrew school until I had a bat mitzvah. And I just had this feeling that Judaism did have mystical, trippy, meditative components that we just had no idea about, and we didn't even know where to go looking for it. So that, and I think it was my own rebellion against my parents that made me kind of almost want to like troll them back with their own Judaism. Be like, you can't run from this. Like, here you are sending me to Hebrew school, and like I'm coming home to kirtan. Like, what's going on? And I think that was also motivated by a lot of the hypocrisy that I grew up with. Is like when you're growing up in a spiritual community where people wear their spirituality on their sleeve, literally, like they're coming into my house with bindis and Indian robes and, acting like they're so enlightened, and then behind the scenes everyone's been divorced 3 times, and like family arguments and fighting over money and all of this very like low level crap, made me very disillusioned. And so I didn't, my rebellion became kind of dissociating. Like my parents, every time I had an issue, my parents would be like, be here now. And like, so what do you do? What do you do with that? Like, okay, you guys are the reason I don't want to be here right now. So it really is a spiritual conundrum. And I was dissociated for a long time. I developed an eating disorder. My dad's been married 4 times, and I have 6 siblings from all these different places, and there's a lot of trauma behind the scenes of this very colorful, eclectic family. It doesn't mean there's not a lot of love, but it's each one of us has like our own very special, package of issues to talk about in therapy. So, yeah.
One thing that we know about psychedelics is that they help with trauma. They're, or at least a conduit to at least open up a form of healing if the work and integration is done. I'm interested if your family has used psychedelics in that way to heal from some of this trauma, not only lived trauma, but also you talk in the book about intergenerational trauma, which maybe some people, what does that even mean?
Yeah, so and I'll start with the easy question. Intergenerational trauma is there's a theory called epigenetics, which is about how the trauma that your ancestors experienced influences the way your genes function. It doesn't necessarily change the DNA, just the function of the DNA. And so, for instance, if we come from families who were running from pogroms or were in the Holocaust or whatever, we might have developed like a hypervigilance that we no longer need for our survival, and so it manifests as just like insane neuroticism and other forms of anxiety. The neuroses run deep. And I have my family, for my parents to even like acknowledge their trauma would be like, one day. But I think, so I can't say that they've used psychedelics for that reason, but they also are both very heavy cannabis users, and so I would say that whether or not they're consciously trying to treat their trauma or anxieties or whatever, they are self-medicating. My siblings, as far as I know, haven't actively made that an intention with their psychedelic work. My brother is almost like his rebellion is like trying to be like really normal and like anti-hippie, so I don't even know if he's doing psychedelics. But I have personally like run into my trauma in psychedelic work, and I don't know if you wanted to get to the 5-MeO thing now or whatever, but I basically have noticed that my body, the more I become aware of my body and come back into my body through, like 10, 15 years following having tried to get over an eating disorder, which thank God I feel like I've done it, is noticing there's so much fear in my body and like the decibel that I run at and how quickly my heart beats, and realizing like some of that does not belong to me. Like it's just, yes, there's my own pain and stuff that I've experienced, but I also recognize that my nervous system is sort of like tuned to a certain frequency that is just my genetic coding.
Yeah, do you want to read the 5-MeO?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Madison's going to read another one.
Okay. There's like 2 chapters technically, I think, that mention the 5-MeO, but yeah. Okay. So I'll read until I feel like this is 4 pages. You think that's too much to read at once, or?
4 pages? Hey.
I'll skip if necessary. Okay, Trauma, Trust, and Toad Venom, chapter 23. One of Reb Nachman's most famous sayings goes something like, "The world is a narrow bridge, and the most important thing is to not be afraid." So when fear lives in your body from generations past, Not being afraid becomes a process of learning to regulate the nervous system, so much as it is a conscious decision of emunah, or faith, in daunting moments that call for a leap of faith. It's one thing to know that God has your back, it's another thing to feel it. My experience with 5-MeO-DMT, aka the God molecule, was a lesson in all of the above. On a cloudy Sunday morning in late spring, I Ubered from Los Feliz to Topanga, taking winding canyons through the valley as I clutched onto Anani, the little blue and silver hardcover, reading prayers in Hebrew and English for healing, journeying, health, and so on. I arrived at a chic rustic home tucked away in the hills, with wooden decks boasting views of the mountains and pebble floors inside. Because my guides told me I shouldn't drive myself home afterward, I had arranged to get a ride from my friend Roxanne, who had helped me through challenging trips in the past and lived with me on the 3rd floor of Cloyne's West Wing, in college, basically. I was a ball of nerves. As I got comfy on a cozy blanketed floor cushion, my guides explained how this would go down. First, a baby dose of the venom inhaled through a fancy vaporizer to get acquainted with the medicine. Then a full dose, which would last about 25 minutes, and if I felt like it, I could do a third, smaller dose after that. I don't know how long it took after the second dose for me to start freaking out, as the medicine began to slaughter my ego and any sense of time. I discovered that once the toad hits, you are not really there anymore. You dissolve within a matter of minutes, if not seconds, and what's left is pure, boundless consciousness. Meanwhile, your body's nervous system is left to its own devices. Am I okay? Am I okay? I repeated the question over and over as I was coming up on the second dose. I don't even know if I was conscious that I was talking. I was so scared of the medicine, of losing myself. I was just scared. I use a lot of different words that the glossary helps you understand. And I realized my fear of the medicine was just a proxy, a surface level fear, an opportunity to be afraid of something in my actual life to justify the fear that was already living within my body. I wasn't just scared of the medicine, I was scared of life itself. My genes were programmed to be fearful, to be vigilant, to wonder incessantly, am I okay? Or in other words, am I safe? The trauma living within me from my own life, and it seemed from generations past, bubbled up to the surface. I never felt so innately Jewish as when I did 5-MeO-DMT. This time, however, rather than the flavor of Yiddishkeit coming from the outside in, the nigunim as medicine music and ayahuasca ceremonies, and the mystical teachings, and the community of kindred spirits encouraging me to pray under the medicine, here my sense of Jewishness came from the inside out. In the experience of my own lifetime, my parents' divorce triggered the trauma of insecurity and abandonment. The phrase, worrying is praying for what you don't want, rang especially true for my mother, whose distress over money was manifest in hyperbolic threats of homelessness, while my father, on the other hand, who never quite got over losing his own father and older brother, carried the tendency of emotional shutdown when it came to needs of the heart. His own mother, naturally, had grown distant in the aftermath of losing her son and husband, not to mention having grown up as an orphan herself. My ancestors, too, had fled the Spanish Inquisition on my father's side, heading east where on all sides of the family, they survived pogroms in places like Belarus, Lithuania, Austria, Poland, and Ukraine, back then known as Galicia, until they eventually immigrated to New York through Ellis Island. They had Yiddish names like Shlomi, Rachel, Aro, and Sora, and took on English names like Solomon, Rose, Harry, and Sylvia to fit into American society. The family they left behind in Europe all perished in the Holocaust. As a child, I was obsessed with and terrified of anti-Semitism. I wondered if I looked Jewish enough to be targeted and was an avid reader of young adult Holocaust literature. I connected deeply with Anne Frank because she was a writer and a little rebellious. These things stick with us, often in ways we're unaware of. And so, as the toad venom was not so subtly revealing to me, my body leans toward hypervigilance, ready for the moment in which the answer to that aching question, are you okay, is no, I'm not okay. Perhaps adaptive behaviors like hypervigilance enabled my ancestors to survive, but now it was working against me. In the context of all the race-based systemic trauma out there affecting populations of Native Americans, African Americans, and so forth, was this my own psychedelically triggered experience of what's considered Jewish trauma? It was certainly an expression of a type of anxiety that lives inside me, within my Jewish body. At first I was so dissociated, I didn't even register the sound of my guides telling me to breathe. Somewhere in the ether of my ego's non-existence, I dissolved into everything and nothing. I can't fully remember what was going on up there, but when I came down I was relieved, mainly because I was okay. Of course I was, but I still hadn't quite grasped the gravity of what my guides meant when they said breathe, thinking they were maybe just trying to tell me to relax. Instead they meant something more specific. My guides offered me a final dose, and with it an opportunity to practice the breathing exercises they tried to get through to me during the blast off. Maybe this was a chance to do tshuva, or return, with the toad. With breath in my toolkit, I gave the venom another shot, albeit at a lower dose than before. I inhaled and exhaled as they instructed me, feeling the rhythm of air enter and leave my body. And finally, I tasted just a little bit of breath. Lying down, knees bent, one hand over the heart, the other over my gut, I took 3 big breaths into the belly, then 3 into the chest, and did that 3 times in succession. A sense of relief came over me like a wave as I stayed with the breathing technique, while the medicine wore off and I re-entered my body. I was home. I was home. That's what tripping is about anyway. You take a psychedelic and you journey into another realm, all with the intention of returning home to yourself, your soul comfortably and sensationally in the body. Each breath, according to the sages, merges in connection with the supernal breath that enters a person's body at all times. The neshama, or soul, praises source through the neshima, or breath. So the words for source, or for soul and breath in Hebrew are related. In other words, Rabbi Dr. Pinson explains, here there is no longer any I. There is no more separate self, no independent existence. There is no thing to experience. There is no experience, no I to register the experience. One is one with the one, and is so with the no awareness of such unity. The experiencer is one with the experienced. This is almost exactly what I, or well, the not I, experienced with 5-MeO. And it was through the breathing techniques, literally feeling the expansion and contraction of my belly and chest as air moved in and out of my corpus, that I was able to embody the rhythm of creation itself, reflected in the expansion and contraction process known as Tzimtzum, the very method by which God created the world. I left the session with homework to practice the breathing exercise at least once or twice a day going forward. Like learning a word in a foreign language that sheds light on a concept unique to that culture, the exercises made me more aware of the way I breathed in the context of stress.
Wow. I think to some people that experience can sound terrifying. It sounds to me a little terrifying. And so we're talking a lot about psychedelics, but in terms of your own healing and your own journey with psychedelics, is it just the psychedelics that equal healing, or is there other things that you do in your life that are maybe more profound ways of healing?
Yeah, I mean, I have this joke like, acid's cool, but have you done yoga every day? And I think that's really true. I've done acid several times, and not every psychedelic trip is life-changing. Sometimes it's just fun, and fun can also be like, that's a lifestyle. I think there's this whole medicine culture today, which I, have some issues with the rhetoric of it, because calling psychedelics medicine is good in some ways, because it gets you to reframe how you think of it and put intention into it, and you want to get better and you want to heal. But you don't have to have something wrong with you to justify the fact that you want to use these substances. And you can say you want to have fun, and you can say you want a spiritual experience, and you can say that, you're curious, and that's all okay. And so I think this culture of healing and medicine is great for some people, and for other people it's just like keeps them in, paradigms of being sick, and, helps pharmaceutical companies like justify overcharging for psychedelic inspired compounds. So that's a whole other story and a rant, but to answer your question, it's the set and setting. Like, it's not just the substance, it's almost never the substance in and of itself. That's the healing thing. I think it's the way you integrate it and, how you make sense of it in your regular life.
I think to switch gears a little bit and talk about, we're in 2024, it seems like not a week goes by without a magazine or a newspaper talking about the future of psychedelics. I'm interested in what you're excited about in terms of the future of, MDMA entering phase 3 and all these exciting things in terms of the medicinal legalization of psychedelics, but also what concerns you about that future.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely high times in some ways. It depends, like, in the Jewish world, it's like 1969. Like, really, like, every single weekend, there are multiple ceremonies happening with ayahuasca, mushrooms, 5-MeO, MDMA, whatever, in the Yiddish-speaking world here in New York, and it's insane. And part of me is excited for that because a community, most of whom are descended from straight Holocaust survivors, are finally taking their healing seriously. And the other part of me worries that with the proliferation of psychedelics in that community and also in general, like, there is like a sort of like black magic, dark side, shadow side, whatever you want to call it, and people aren't giving these substances like the reverence that they deserve. They don't know what they're doing. Things like set and setting, which is your internal state going into a trip, and the surroundings, that characterize everything else about it. Like, that's not common knowledge for everybody, and it's serious, like, public education issue. I also think, like, because psychedelics are becoming more mainstream and pharmaceuticalized and marketed and whatever, it's good for people who wouldn't ordinarily want to try psychedelics to now be open to these experiences because it feels more safe and kosher. And by the same token, like, questions of access and equitability and like whether the clinical setting is even the right setting for healing. And I don't think there's a hierarchy of how to heal. I think it's just, there's no right way to do psychedelics, and I don't want it to be the case that only MDMA in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy with a very particular prescription for PTSD, like, that's not the only way to do MDMA. And for that to be put out there as if it's the right way to do it is just, like, not right. That's wrong. Not to say that, like, that's not a right way, but it's not the only way. So I think really, like, broadening the public consciousness around the, legitimacy of different psychedelic paradigms and psychedelic authorities coming from more indigenous spiritual practices, more clinical, medical, therapeutic, even, again, the legitimacy of, like, the old guard, the Grateful Dead heads and people who make art from psychedelics and music, and, no one's, like, at least in the public conversation today, like, no one is paying homage to that generation in ways that I think they should. So I don't know if that covers, like, my excitement or is more of a hater type of response, but yeah.
So you think there needs to be decriminalization?
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely. I mean, it's not like decriminalization is not, people are using these substances anyways. I mean, in an ideal world, like, they would be decriminalized, and people would also, it would be, I don't want to say regulated, but there would be ways for people to know their dosage, like, if it's pure, what exactly is in it, like, all the details around it, so it's not, like, shrouded in this kind of, like, so you have, like, all the information, which I think makes it safer.
So it would be regulated not through the government.
Yeah.
But, okay.
I mean, I think it would be decriminalized, and I think there could be regulation as well, but I don't think that those need to exist in mutually exclusive paradigms.
Yeah.
Who's going to regulate? So, I mean, I've thought about this before. I probably should be facing partially this way too. Sorry. So I think it would be great if there were more, like, independent agencies, like, and again, here we are, Judaism and psychedelics, but, like, if something's kosher, there's an independent agency that is actually, like, verifying its kosher status. And it's not a government agency, and I don't think the government knows enough about psychedelics to even, like, put together the proper policies and legislations. Granted, they're working with psychedelic lawyers and policy wonks and mostly people with industrial interests in the psychedelic space. But I think if there was an independent nonprofit agency that was helping to standardize it, you could, if there was, if something has like the stamp of the HECSHER, the stamp of approval from such an agency, then you kind of know. So it doesn't have to go necessarily through the government, but if there's a decriminalized market and then agencies are free to sort of like crop up in this way. I mean, we have in the state of Oregon decriminalization across the board, and you can also, yes, go through the state in order to get licensed to serve psilocybin. They have like a psilocybin therapy legalization measure there. But you don't have to be necessarily like a licensed therapist per se. And so I think also taking it out of like specific industries and professions democratizes it and also opens it up to different, what's the word, like, I'm trying to help me with the word, like different, what?
Entities.
Not just different entities, but like different types of authority when it comes to taking psychedelics. Like a rabbi could be licensed to give psychedelics, and so could a social worker, and so could just like a sensitive person who's been serving them underground for 20 years and finally has like a legal avenue to admit that.
It makes it more community-based.
Yeah, exactly. Now, granted, I'm not a policy expert, so this is just me riffing. Don't quote me.
We're talking about Judaism, psychedelics. I want to get to Ram Dass in a little bit. But what does community mean to you? I feel like I've not struggled, but I'm constantly redefining what community means to me.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, as someone who is really community oriented, meaning to say that like, there's this word, I grew up in the satsang, which are the community of devotees of the guru who all, you have satsang here in New York, you have satsang in LA, you have satsang around the world, and it's sort of soul family. Like, okay, you have this thing in common, which is your devotion or your association with Ram Dass, with Maharaji. In the Jewish world, at least the one that I'm most associated with, there's something called the chevra. Now, chevra in general just means like your friends or whatever, but I feel like people use it to talk about the chevra, and it goes back to, different kind of like micro communities associated with, like Shlomo Karlebach, who is kind of a controversial character, but he was a big Jewish rabbi and musician who people congregated around him in the sort of Haight-Ashbury times, and he took all the Jews of Haight-Ashbury and kind of got them religious. They started little slogans like LSD, let's start davening, or POT, put on tefillin. So yeah, community. So again, like for me, a community is like my soul family, like the people who I meet, who I'm like, okay, you're familiar, like, so I have a friend he said like, it's like there's one Jewish nation and 12 different tribes. And so like, I know like there's Jewish communities that I'm just like, these are not my people, like get me out of here. And then there's, whatever, it's not, they are my people on some level, but there's the people who I just feel like family with, and so it's like, who's showing up to your wedding, like who's showing up to a funeral, who's showing up to your kid's bar mitzvah, who's showing up to a bris, like that's what community is. Who are you inviting over for Shabbos dinner? Who's coming to your birthday? Like who's gathering at moments when it matters, basically, and that's community. And again, there's professional communities which are a little bit less personally motivated, but yeah.
You mentioned a lot of Hebrew words throughout this book, and the glossary is very helpful, but you mentioned words that I've heard my whole life. I grew up Reformed Jewish, very secular, but I've always heard about Kabbalah and Kabbalistic tradition, but I don't know what that is. Can you describe or give us some understanding of what that is?
Yeah, so Kabbalah is this like science of mysticism, basically. It's like the Jewish mystical tradition, and it's really refers to the way that like divine light, like the light of God, emanates in this world from the highest level world, and so it comes in different like spheres or realms until it's like the lowest, which is like earth. It's called Malchus, which also means queendom. And so the idea being that like that which is the lowest, Malchus, or the queen, is actually the highest, right? So, that's just one psychedelic lesson, is like we think we want to get so high, up in the psychonautic realms, but really like the magic is right here, like in the earth, like plant a tree, like very basic stuff. So your question about Kabbalah, and what was the other, about the words I used in the book, or what was?
Well, there was another word that, Hamish.
Hamish, yes. That goes back to your question about community. So, Hamish, or in another dialect of Yiddish, Hamish, means homie, essentially. But it's like so much deeper than that. And so when I were to use the word Hamish and pronounce it as Hamish, I'd be referring to something that feels like familiar, homey, casual, like treats you like family. You could also talk about like Heimish food, which is sort of like Jewish soul food, like Hasidic food, basically, from Eastern Europe, cholent, kugel. People also use the word Heimish, pronounced that way, to talk about like, there's these buses that go from Brooklyn to Monsey. They're Heimish buses because it's basically serving only Yiddish speakers, and there's a mechitza in the middle of the bus separating men and women. So that's pretty Heimish. Yeah.
You see that? When I went to school in London, and I was seeking a Jewish space, and I went to Chabad, and incorrectly and quite ignorantly, I went to shake the rabbi's wife's hand. Dumb. Should have done that.
You
but
didn't know.
I did not know, and also they did not use it as a moment to explain, and then we were immediately separated.
They never explain.
Why?
I once tried to hug my Chabad rabbi in college, and he was backing away, and I didn't understand what was going on. Like I kept going further into the hug. Why don't they explain? What's the question?
Well, the question is, everything that you've talked about with Judaism, it makes me want to be more Jewish, more spiritual in my Judaism. But then stuff like that, to know that the bus to Monsey is separated by men and women, that sits sour with me.
But the thing is, it's like, people say this all the time, coming from like the more secular reform places, is like, oh, like, Judaism is great, but like the oppression of women or something. And the thing is like there are a ton of issues in every religious community, no matter what. And I'll say that like the women also, like having, like I work, I spend a lot of time in this community now, and the women also want to be in their own space. Like it's not just, if you go, maybe like a mechitza is just like a very normal thing, and so it's not like on the bus you're like being oppressed. Like you go to a wedding, and there's also mechitza on the dance floor, like a separator between men and women. And if you look at the women's side of the mechitza, like those girls are getting down. Like they're really like going as free as possible, and it actually engenders a space where like these all women's spaces that there's a sense of sisterhood, there's a sense of like you can be who you are without having to like really worry about like the male gaze, or you can dance how you want without being sexualized or anything like that. Now granted, like, is it problematic? Like, on some levels, sure. There's a restriction, or there's a rule, something called kol isha, which has to do with if you can hear a woman sing. And basically, if you're in a situation, like an Orthodox situation, the women are not singing by themselves, and what I've observed actually in these ayahuasca ceremonies that I've been in with Hasidim is that a woman may want to sing in that ceremony. Also, the ceremony itself has the men's side and the women's side. Now, granted, there's not a mechitza down the middle because there's like a whole, like altar situation with candles. But, it does have that kind of element of separation, because I think for people to just like stay in their own lane, focus on themselves, like not be distracted by, whatever thoughts that would distract them from just like focusing on themselves and God, that's the point of that. And anyways, in these ceremonies, they are kind of becoming more okay with things like kol isha, which is, again, sounds like no big deal. Okay, some women sing a song in ceremony, but it's actually kind of revolutionary for that community. And so that's how psychedelics really are chipping away a little bit at the rigidity of religion that can become oppressive or traumatizing for people.
Thinking about how psychedelics break away at the rigidity of something, I think Israel-Palestine, the conflict, what's going on over there is deeply on people's minds since October 7th, particularly. I'm interested if you think that psychedelics have a role to play in the trauma that exists there.
Like in healing it or in promoting it?
In healing it, yeah.
Okay, because it goes both ways.
I would be interested to know that too.
Yeah, so I split my time between here and Israel, between New York and Israel, and I was there on October 7th and into October, and came back, a little bit before my book launch, and I was reporting a story on Jews and Palestinians drinking ayahuasca together in a ceremony study project in Spain. So, I was literally in Ramallah, October 5th, doing all this reporting. And, I asked the question, I'm like, this is a nice idea, this is great for the 30 people who participated in the study, what does that have to do with the rest of this conflict? I mean, not to be a naysayer, just to really poke holes in what's the point? And, one person said to me, it's just planting seeds. It's each of those 30 people, who might feel less alien, less othered, have more of an open heart toward the quote unquote other, is going to tell their friends, and their it's a droplet in an ocean. They have talked about a ripple effect. Now, by the same token, I'd also spent time in other parts of the West Bank reporting on these quote unquote hippies with guns, and so there's settlements where people that look like hippie meccas, right? It's people are wearing sandals and white linens and growing their own food and milking their own cows and have dreadlocks and playing dreadlock players side curls and playing guitar and whatever, and meanwhile they're wearing M16s on their shoulders and are considered to be very aggressive toward Palestinians who live in the next village over. And it's very much this sort of Wild West. It feels like cowboys and Indians a little bit, it's just tribes against the tribes. And all these people are doing psychedelics, they're very influenced by it, and I think it really influences a sense of messianic consciousness, where it's and there is the messianic syndrome is a thing with psychedelic use, people get think they're Jesus or something like that. Granted, I think messianism, as it's expressed, if you're fanatical enough to want to live in a place where you have to carry a gun on your arm at all times, or you feel you do, and not forgetting the political issues, this is not my commentary on the settlements, but forgetting the political issues about just kicking people out of their own neighborhoods and villages, that's a level of altered consciousness. And again, the prevalence of psychedelics in the West Bank on all sides of the equation is complicated. And so when I ask are psychedelics healing, fueling or healing trauma on all sides. Now, once the war broke out, I put all these stories on pause because I didn't think it was appropriate to be reporting them, and whatever, given the context. And, one person said to me, psychedelic thinking is the ability to hold multiple truths at once. And I think that's what we really need to keep in mind as we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is everyone has different truths, different senses of reality, different paradigms, and they're all fighting over and living in the same place. And it's going to take psychedelic thinking and psychedelic strategizing to transcend the binaries in order to really arrive at a quote unquote solution. And the other thing with psychedelics is that they're getting us to acknowledge trauma, because so much of the industry is so trauma informed at this point. And so, hopefully a psychedelic focus as applied to Israel-Palestine will get people to think about the route of the least trauma inflicted, And again, I wish that would apply to, like, governments and commanders of the IDF, but on the ground, that's my prayer and my wish. And there is a lot of psychedelic healing happening already, especially for survivors of the Nova Festival, where immediately almost a lot of psychedelic and otherwise types of like retreat centers opened up on Kibbutzim, and I think there's a hospital in the south actually that's been working with psychedelic therapy for survivors of Nova, which is important because a lot of the people who survived were tripping.
Yeah, I'd love to open the floor up to some questions, and then I would love for you to also read, or maybe you could do this first. I think it's page 25. The chapter's called "That Time Ram Dass, My Troll Flipped Me Off."
Yeah.
Could you read that?
Yeah, okay, sure.
Thank you.
I always wondered if Ram Dass was in on his own bit. Did he see beyond the fanfare surrounding him, or was he just as full of it as those who dress up in robes to pay their respects when he passed through town, or to visit him in Hawaii when he settled down there? He officiated the spiritual marriage between my father and stepmother when I was 11, which meant at the time that he was automatically on my teenage shit list. I remember they bought us girls saris to wear at the wedding held at the casa. I didn't even unpack mine from its plastic covering and showed up in black sweats, taking a corner seat in one of the rented white folding chairs that filled up the courtyard, facing an outdoor staircase leading up to a balcony where the ceremony took place. I was loyal to my mother, and within just a year of my parents' split, I wasn't ready to digest the new reality. I don't think I stayed so much as half an hour before I ghosted the wedding in tears, meeting my mother outside the house to get picked up. From my hurt, childish, and dramatic perspective, I didn't think Ram Dass appreciated all angles of the situation he was party to. Or maybe he was just being a pal to my dad. I was in middle school and becoming quite skilled at bottling my feelings. But as they say, the body keeps the score. The following year, I was in 7th grade when I lined up inside the girls' locker room until it was my turn to bend down and touch my toes as an admin traced the path of my spine. Wearing my green mesh PE shorts and one of those sparkly pink training bras my father bought me from the Gap, attempting to fill out the drawers from my bedroom at his house where I kept only very little of my actual stuff, it's easy enough to see by the hunch on the upper right side of my back that my spine was curved. They sent me home with a slip saying that I needed to see an orthopedist, and lo and behold, I was diagnosed with moderate to severe scoliosis. I would be forced to wear a brace until I was done growing, which luckily was only a year or so later, but unluckily meant I'd have to wear it to school. When all the other girls were donning skin-tight tops and low-rise jeans, I tried to hide the brace underneath baggy sweatshirts. I avoided surgery by the skin of my teeth, although no doctor would have denied it to me. My parents, however, being the hippies they are, explored alternative treatments, eventually forcing me into a yoga practice at the age of 12, and which has stayed with me ever since. The yoga mat became my safe space, and suddenly I was doing grown-up things with my parents, accompanying my mom to level 2-3 vinyasa classes at Yoga Works, where she herself was trained as a yoga teacher, or going with my dad on weekend mornings to dancing Shiva on Beverly Boulevard, or Bhakti Yoga Shala in Santa Monica. For my father, yoga is a religious practice, one he's devoted to as much as any Orthodox Jew is devoted to daily davening. Praying. Yoga was sacred in my family, and I never questioned that. How could I when it was our saving grace, the only thing that would come to save me from myself as my mental health spiraled during my teenage years? I fell in love with the open space of the studios, the hardwood floors, the exposed brick walls, the wafting fragrance of incense or essential oils filling the room. As a kid, I'd never stuck to anything athletic, even though I'd cycled through everything from soccer to ballet to tap dance to gymnastics. Although in high school, I did run on the cross-country and track teams. Still, yoga was different. I pride myself in arching from Tadasana into wheel, getting my hands flat on the ground in Uttanasana, balancing into the perfect tree pose. But the point of yoga, my parents and teachers taught me from the get-go, was that there was no perfect, no competition, no pride. It taught me to be humble while simultaneously motivating me to be strong and flexible. When I was younger, I would walk down the hallway attempting to balance a stack of books on my head in order to hone my posture. Yoga gave me the tools to refine the way I held myself, and the awareness to articulate my body and ultimately the way I felt in it. There was also a rigor to yoga, spiritual and embodied, that felt genuine in a way that weirdly paralleled the authenticity I picked up on in more traditional Jewish contexts. Yoga was like Hasidus for the body, although at the time I wouldn't have had the vocabulary, let alone the exposure to articulate it. Hasidus being like Hasidism or direct spiritual relationship with God. But I knew that bhakti, the devotional aspect of yoga, which in Hinduism parallels the concept of Hasidus, felt like a direct, unmediated connection to God, while yoga felt like a prayer made with the body. I was curious about Hasidism, but there was little opportunity for exploration. Though on occasion, when walking through the neighborhood, my father might wander into an Orthodox shul to soak up the singing. At least they actually know what's going on in there, what they're talking about, he would joke, referencing how little Reform Jews tend to grasp about the religion. With all my family's mishigas, or craziness, Judaism always felt like home, a common ground we shared, where the lack of authentic religious depth I suspected in New Age circles was less of an issue, at least as much as the lack of substantive education I experienced in Hebrew school. Generally, though, in my family, be here now was the catch-all for spiritual sustenance. Be here now? Be here now? Really? It felt like trolling. For much of my childhood and teenage years, the here and now were not places I wanted to just be. And yet telling me to be was the best my parents could offer. I grew angsty, dissociative, and escapist. Yet there I was secretly listening to Krishna Das in my headphones to fall asleep at night. The irony of my upbringing is that the foundation upon which I was brought into the world and in which I would come of age. The irony of my upbringing is that the foundation upon which I was brought into the world and in which I would come of age would be the ultimate test to see if the spiritual teachings and tools that I was raised with actually work. It's as if God said to my soul upon bringing me down to earth, I'm going to give you the whole package, the very tools you'll need to get through the situation I'm going to throw you into. Let's see what you do with them. There's a Talmudic adage, from the forest itself comes the handle of the axe that fells it. In other words, the source of your injury is also the source of your healing. My family life contained both the source of my pain and the lessons to help me get through it. I was 16 or 17 on a trip to Hawaii one summer, when my mother took my brother and me to visit Ram Dass. She and I had gotten into an argument that day, and in the throes of teenage nastiness, I'd flipped her off in the not so sly way of scratching my cheek with my middle finger. When we arrived at our RD's house, what did she do but of course use him as the shrink that he is and lay our problems on the poor guy. Granted, I was ashamed of myself when she told on me to Ram Dass, but he simply sat there calm, taking nothing about our mother-daughter spat too seriously. As we parted ways, Ram Dass waved goodbye to me, scratching his own cheek with his middle finger. In one small gesture, he belittled the whole thing in the most loving way. My damaged ego left with nothing to grasp onto.
Thank you, Madison. So yeah, anybody who's got questions? Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. You talked about set and setting. What is that?
So it refers to your internal state going into a psychedelic experience, or any experience really. Your intentions, what's going on for you, what happened to you yesterday that you're still thinking about, what you're sad about, what you're happy about, everything internal. And your setting is the surroundings, who you're with, where you are, what time of day is it, what music is playing, all of these external factors. And they both heavily influence your psychedelic experience.
How many parties did you throw in high school?
0. All of the parties were my dad's. It was kirtan. I was like, trying to get out of there.
Sounds
So you didn't think your dad was cool?
I was so embarrassed. Like, it was just, my dad would come to school functions like reeking of weed, and then like pass out in like the school, the schoolyard, while he was supposed to be like inside like an art show. And like,
Reminds me of my dad.
like, and I mean, it was kind of cute and I didn't care. And I mean, where I grew up, like everyone's parents like went to golf or, you know, like we're just like normal people, and we weren't. And so, and also due to like all of the fighting and, you know, ways that people were treating each other, it was like I associated like that, like family stuff with the, you know, affectations of the Hindu thing. And it was just like, I didn't want, you know, I was just kind of like embarrassed for people to come over. Until I got older, I was probably like 16 when there was a guy, he was like 19, he was the son of one of my dad's friends, and I ended up dating him, and it was like through that little mini high school relationship that I could more accept where I was coming from, because I had like kind of met a guy that I crushed on through a kirtan, and I'm like, oh, maybe it's not so bad. But until that point, I really, I just had to rebel. I didn't, you know, now I think it's cool, but I didn't before. And my little sister, who's 18, is like still going through that.
How old are you?
How old am I now? 32.
Can you speak a little bit to your journey with DoubleBlind and how you kind of got involved with the psychedelics?
Yeah, so my very first college term paper when I was 18 was on psychedelics, and I did all of that before I even tripped. I was at UC Berkeley, so I really went for having that kind of full Berkeley experience. And so I did this research paper, and then over winter break I did mushrooms for the first time, and it was really just one of the best days of my life, and just has inspired me ever since, basically. And so in journalism school, every student had to report on a different ethnic community. And because I'm Jewish, they gave me the Hasidim in Brooklyn. And through that, I ended up meeting these fringe Hasidim who were doing psychedelics like trance parties in the Catskills or ayahuasca circles, and I got really interested in psychedelics as it merged with religion. Fast forward, I started reporting on cannabis after I graduated journalism school, and cannabis was sort of this gateway plant to reporting on psychedelics. And so I don't just write about psychedelics in Judaism. I've written about cannabis and psychedelics in regard to policy, medicine, science, environment, all sorts of culture, whatever. So a former classmate from journalism school contacted me. She'd been meditating, and 5 minutes after she meditated, she had the idea to start a psychedelic magazine and contacted me and said, do you want to start this magazine? I said, sure. And so that became DoubleBlind. And so, I stayed with that for a while, and then, at this point I'm working on books and doing I wrote this book. I have 2 more books that I'm working on, so yeah. One of them is actually this DoubleBlind guide to psychedelics. It's like a coffee table book with a third-party publisher. And then the second is the practical guide version of this. It's like a Jewish psychedelic manual.
I'm curious in day-to-day life, sort of the way you mentioned your friend came up with this idea for the magazine through meditation. I guess just for day-to-day life, how do you access, your higher self, your one consciousness? Not that you have to separate out Judaism or any religion or any psychedelics, but just kind of pure you, just walking down the street or day to day. What do you do? How do you access?
I talk to God. And I know that sounds a little bit crazy or whatever, but first I do yoga a lot. Really, the biggest gift my parents gave me was a yoga practice. Secondly, I also dance on my own. I dance with a hula hoop. It's on my cover of my book.
As do I.
And the third is, so it's this practice. So one of my favorite teachers is Rabbi Nachman, who's a Hasidic master from Ukraine. He's no longer in his body, but he prescribed an hour every day of a practice called hisbodedus, which is basically like talking to God as if he's your best friend. It's just like pour your heart out in seclusion, ideally in nature, in a room, whatever. Granted, I'm not doing it for an hour every day. Maybe it accumulates to an hour, but I just like really tried. And there's another practice that kind of dovetails with it called hisponenus, which is sort of like an internal contemplation. And so the two go hand in hand, where you're really like just taking stock of yourself, and then at the same time just like talking it out. And I'd say like I have these moments where I really can just like go inside and just like feel like I'm like having a legitimate conversation with God. You know, my dad jokes, he's like, you're talking to God, but is God talking back? And, you know, I guess like depends, you know, what kind of state of mind you're in. But yeah, that's really like what it is. It's just feeling like I'm connected and able to manifest on the conversation that I'm having with God. Yeah.
Kind of bouncing off to your last question. What general piece of advice would you give to somebody that tends to be in a lot of altered states and then just barely integrating himself back to like a modern world or society, and then back? Like, what would your biggest advice be, like integrating like 5D realms into the 3D?
Well, like, why do they keep doing it? Like, can they stop doing this? Like, can they start like integrating for longer periods of time in between their substance use? Are you talking about altered states like through substances? Or
Just in general, like even without substances.
I mean, I think there's like something really refreshing about just like being like, again, being here and now, like in the lowest level of reality and seeing the magic in the mundane. And like that's the point, you know, there's this concept in Judaism like ascent or descent for the sake of ascent, and also vice versa, ascent for the sake of descent. And so a lot of spiritual philosophy is like, you know, like we have difficult moments in order to reach moments of transcendence, right? Like slavery in Egypt for the opportunity of like liberation, and you know, that's some sort of ascent. But I think also we have ascent for descent, which is like we have these high states, right? Like and the point of them is not just to stay high, but to like what do you do when you inevitably come back down? And so you really have to like harness that consciousness, like the consciousness of the medicine or the psychedelic or the whatever, and integrate it into your daily life. Now, for me, like part of my integration philosophy, if I'm using a psychedelic or even like having a really, you know, lit Shabbos and just like feeling, you know, just like feeling high off like whatever environment I'm in, is like taking something sensory from that experience, like something with the body, because the body is so the opposite of high. It's like really like right here and real, and bringing that into your regular life. So if you do a particular yoga pose, pray a certain way, meditate a certain way, do a certain type of breath work, listen to a certain song, you know, paint something, journal something, whatever, during the heightened experience, and then you like take those as like souvenirs for your regular life, I think it really helps harness the consciousness and creates a practice.
I love that.
You and then you. But then, okay, I don't know what order I'm going in. Start here.
So I find that there's a similarity in my experience, like just going for a hike. Like there's a very human presence that happens just walking through the woods. Like I'm no longer my job title, I'm no longer the associates of my friends, I'm just this human being walking in nature. And I find that on psychedelics, I find there to be a similar feeling or presence. Do you find, in your experience in the kind of psychedelic world, do you think that there's any kind of optimism in terms of like climate change and people feeling integrated with the environment and a kind of deeper respect for the environment?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I also love the way you started your question with just like forgetting about who you are and like the world and just like being a human in nature. And I think part of the promise of psychedelics is that they make us feel more human, like more of the natural world. And I think a lot of people who've had profound experiences in nature through psychedelic work do end up becoming climate activists, or even just in their own personal lives treating the environment, having more environmental awareness. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Was there another question here? Yeah.
Yeah, another advice question. I was curious if you have any recommendations for somebody, me, who's trying to grow their own spiritual Jewish practice. If there's like books you recommend, obviously yours. I know you mentioned earlier the magic of the ordinary, I think you called
Yeah.
it, but if there's just any other recommendations you
Yeah, Magic of the Ordinary. There's also a book called The Sabbath by Heschel. And that sort of talks about like Shabbat as this transcendent palace in time, like time out of time, and it just feels like such a psychedelic concept. I also read like Aria Kaplan's like Practical Guide to Meditation, which again, if you read his writing, you're like, has this guy tripped? What else? I mean, you can contact me after, like I have like a total, like there, the Jewish, I co-founded the Jewish Psychedelic Summit, so if you go to the website, it's .org, there's a whole resources page of articles.
Cool.
Yeah, and then there were 2 questions here. You, yeah.
Hi, thank you. I have a few questions. So what's ketamine? Is that, I heard you mention ketamine. Is that also related to anything you've done?
Yeah, I've done ketamine for sure. Ketamine is technically like, it's a dissociative. It's debatable whether it's a psychedelic. I mean, it's clumped in with psychedelics, so it's not a classical psychedelic like mushrooms or LSD, but it's a dissociative analgesic, right? Yeah, and it's used, technically it's legal, but it's used off-label, or there's like these legal loopholes pretty much, and so as you probably know, there's all these clinics everywhere that offer ketamine therapy.
Yeah, hearing more and more about it. So, Boo Jews, and you mentioned it too. Why do you think so many Jews mostly give up Judaism and become Hindus, Buddhists? Do you have any feelings or ideas about that?
Yeah,
I can answer that.
oh sure,
It was very funny because it's something that I was thinking of because I'm closer to your parents' age, and the thing I read somewhere was that since the Holocaust, we lost most of our teachers. And so the children that grew up with, like my parents migrated from Poland and Russia. My father was born here, my mother migrated when she was a teenager. They didn't have the teachers. And with the psychedelics, the best philosophy was the Eastern, which has a lot of
living teachers.
yeah, and so therefore we became Hindus, and because there were no Jewish teachers. And now, as we've grown up and we're going back to our roots, there's been more of this generation. But like I said, one of the best things that you have is yoga.
Yeah.
And I do too, and that is something for me that really helps me with being, I'm not a religious Jew, I'm a national Jew. I mean, I love my heritage and all that, but my sense with God is just too vindictive for me. So I sort of just leave that there. And anyway, that's the reason that I believe.
Did you have more to add?
No, do you identify as a Hindu?
Yeah, I'm a Buddhist, I think.
Cool. So yeah, she nailed it, and I think one of, like, Shlomo Karlovac said something where, like, everyone who came out of the Holocaust was so tainted with the trauma of the Holocaust that they just couldn't, like, express, like, that level of, like, Jewish life and vigor and, like, spirit. Like, these are, like, Holocaust survivors. Like, the fact that they just have their life is enough. Like, think, the type of enthusiasm and inspiration you would need in order to give it over to the next generation was not necessarily there. And so my parents, maybe you, whatever, grew up with like this dry form of Judaism that just was not cutting it. And like I said before, I think there's also a level of like self-medicating that's going on. Like, people are drawn to cannabis or psychedelics, and again, maybe for spiritual reasons or for fun or whatever, but there's a therapeutic element no matter how you cut it or how you slice it. And then what was the last thing I was going to say is, so the trauma, and then yeah, like I think there's something to like the Jewish soul about like seeking, right? Like there's that classic like joke about there's this Baba, like some spiritual master at the top of some mountaintop in India, and everyone's coming to see him, and an older Jewish woman is like really like making her way to the top. She's like, let me just come and talk to him. Like I just have 3 words. And she comes to the top, and it's like, you've heard this? Yeah, come home, son. And so that's it. I think it's a generational thing, and most of the people, the psychedelically like spiritual Jews who I know of my generation aren't. I mean, yes, people go to India, mostly like secular Israelis after the army. But they're all going to like South America, Brazil, like doing ayahuasca, and a lot of them are coming back to Judaism through, Burning Man, like milk and honey tent, or rainbow gathering, or just, getting involved in the type of stuff that I'm writing about.
And then I have a third question.
Well, I just wanted to ask about what you were saying, I don't know if you're aware of this, what you're saying, but we can't overlook the rage that happened because of the Holocaust. There was tremendous rage against God and a repudiation of God as having repudiated Jewish people. So that's part of, I think, also why a lot of Jews turn to other things like Buddhism, Hinduism, because God was like, the heck with it.
It's a great point, yeah.
So my third question is maybe more of a question for everybody. So we moved from Cambridge, Mass here during COVID, and we've been fortunate to spend time in Maui with Ram Dass, and I've been with lots of, I don't want to go through the list, name drop all the people, that I've had a chance to be with, but here in this area, I have not been able to find a Sangha.
I honestly,
And you're
haven't.
not from here, I don't think.
No, well, okay, so I'll tell you that like KD, Christian, whatever, like there are the original Hindus who I grew up with, like some of them are in Pomona and New City, but there isn't like an active satsang, like kirtan scene the way that I was familiar. I know Nina Rao, I think, does stuff here and there, sometimes in Brooklyn, but Nina Rao works with Krishna Das. I mean, it is a great question, and I also feel generally disconnected at this point from the at least like the Maharaji satsang. Like, and I think maybe it's because everyone is in their 80s. At least of the people who I'm
There's a really
close with.
vibrant RD community online, incredibly vibrant online, but I'm looking for something in person. So I'm putting this out to
Yeah.
the room, in case anybody here knows of.
Does Kripalu do?
Well, Kyle's not really that, I live in, we live 10 minutes from Omega, and there's nothing,
And there's
nothing.
So I know that there's a community, Flowering Sun, that is filled with a lot of devotees, which is out of Ironville. And people have kind of sprinkled in, I would say, throughout Walk Hill, New Paltz.
Isn't there like an ashram in like Massachusetts or something? I know for Bandara, when they were doing something in Taos, they were also doing something
Yeah,
like
there is in Barry, Mass, but I'm thinking more
Like
local.
here, yeah. I'd love to know.
That
Flowering Sun,
yeah.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And look, the different drugs that you're taking, were your experiences very different, or were you able to achieve the same spiritual state? I mean, for me, acid was not my friend, and I had really bad experiences, but I took the magic mushrooms, and they brought me back to allow me to be on this earth. Because, it was just a mental thing that I always equated with the natural and the chemical. But I don't know, do you have any of that experience?
Yeah, it's been pretty inconsistent. I mean, I don't do as much as it sounds like I'm so experienced here. This is like, my entire drug history I put in this book pretty much. So I'm more moderate than it seems. But I go through phases. Like acid was not my friend when we first met either. And it took years and little trips that became bigger trips in order to like reprogram that relationship, because I did feel like I wanted to have a relationship with it. You know, mushrooms can like be your best friend and then turn on you in the same trip. It's really, I think about, again, the set and the setting, and I
Well,
think,
just
yeah.
because of the healing properties, you know, just we hear so much about ayahuasca and how, you know, and it is a natural psychedelic, and so I was just wondering what your views were.
I mean, yeah, ayahuasca, all psychedelics, aside from like MDMA and ketamine, I would say the more classical ones are like pretty inconsistent with how the trip is gonna go. You just have no idea what you're gonna experience.
Have you had any experience with holotropic breathing? Do you know anything about that?
I've tried. I haven't. I'm honestly like not good at breath work. Like it actually takes a lot of work to
Yeah, I was just thinking
stay
that
with
that
it.
could be something might be worth exploring.
I want to.
Staying natural.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone. This was, oh yes, one more. There's another question, sorry, one more question.
Yeah, no worries. My question is tailored more towards your writing and being a journalist and speaking. I'm curious what advice you would give in terms of finding your voice and just using your voice, especially as a Jewish woman, and maybe just a little bit of that journey you've been on to get where you are now.
Yeah, I mean, write like as if there's no audience. Like I journal, like I literally write in handwritten journals, and it's just, I know it's for me, and no one's ever gonna read that ever, please God. And I didn't even, you know, I reread all those journals from when I was like 12 till now, and like that's my rawest writing. And so that when you talk about finding your voice, it's like your voice is like who you are without an audience, right? It's like your truest form, and then you can start to finesse it based on the knowledge that someone might actually read what you're writing. And then as far as like being like a Jewish woman, you know, if you are, if that's what you are, you know, it doesn't, I mean, does it mean it's like Jewish women's literature? Like if you're writing about something that's not that, I mean, I'm not sure. It's like, how identified are you with that, like with that identity, and how much does that play into like things you write about other topics, or do you feel like you need to be prompted with like a Jewish women's topic in order to express that part of yourself? To, you know, it's something to explore, and I would just freeform journal about it and see what comes up.
Thank you.
Do you think that there's something at the core of all religions and all kind of spiritual seeking that is essentially a mirror of what people are, or some people are seeking from the psychedelic experience?
Yeah, Aldous Huxley writes about this in Heaven and Hell, which is the addendum essay to Doors of Perception. And he talks about like how the commonality between all of the temples of the world are like these glittering, like high ceilings, and how like geometric patterns and like stuff that looks very kaleidoscopic and psychedelic, and it's just common like anywhere in the world in places that are, you know, with spiritual intention. And so it seems to be that there is sort of this like universal quality to like agnostic spirituality that, or I wouldn't say not, like, you know, spirituality that's like beyond language, beyond cultural identity, and psychedelics can also get you there, but so can other sort of holotropic techniques.
Okay, thank you. I just want to thank TSL and Linda and Claudia and Teo for hosting us, and also to Noah Eckstein for providing the spread that you are all more than welcome to have. Also to Patrick Grego and Rachel Betts for helping out. And also, yes, to Madison, thank you so much. If you want, you can buy Madison's book. We have a bunch of copies, and you can buy them up front, and she will also be signing some books. Okay. Yeah, but there's more.